So somewhere in the early 80s, there's this myth of whether it's a haunted or supposedly government mind control video game. It's completely unlabeled. It's in these arcades in and around, seemingly specifically the Portland, Oregon area. People are playing it. People get, report being dizzy, possibly passing out, dying. It's like shady people show up. They keep checking on the progress of the cabinets. They're not there to collect coins. It's like there may be some Men in Black type figures. And this is the myth of Polybius, the video game cabinet that supposedly doesn't exist. Could be linked to any kinds of things from aliens, government mind control manipulation, or just sheer weird causal things that the panic about video games in the 1980s. I think in a couple of places in my research, one person has been quoted as calling it the Necronomicon of video games, and it's up there with one of the earlier versions of what's now digital folklore. It's still in that cusp of the urban legend where it's like things spread by word of mouth, but possibly the start of the spreading of the idea of this starts in the 90s around things on early versions of Usenet and things of that nature, people talking about weird conspiracy theories and things of that nature.
That's
So
really
it's so there's but it's cool though. It's and it's the start of that weird what I think I like about this is it's in that weird cusp zone of spreading those stories at the playground or whatever, something that happened to somebody's cousins or something like that. But then also the beginning of these, internet conspiracy theories and haunted. It's kind of fun because I feel like we've talked about a lot of things like Ouija boards and mirrors and these things that have always been haunted, but the idea of a video game being sort of a cursed object, kind of a fun modern take that we seem to we really like these ideas. Don't want to let them go.
And they just keep showing up in a new form.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's great. The shadowy world of a game that does not exist. That's wild. Yeah, I know a little bit about this just from my own poking around and interest in tech that can mess with your head and stuff like that. I was going somewhere with that, but it's...
Well, I'll interject for a second.
My brain's all glitchy. I've been playing this game. I keep...
you keep glitching out.
Bill, do you remember what kind of game this was supposed to be? Were there any details? I can't remember. And kind of like what Bob was saying. I remember reading and watching different YouTube, documentaries, for lack of better words, on this a while ago. But I can't remember. Did they ever talk about the type of game it supposedly was?
Well, that's the thing is it's... you're right in that weird, early 80s, right? Very, very early 80s. So it's these, it's supposed to just be it was weird. There's a lot of colors. All the cabinets were unmarked. They were just black cabinets. I can probably extrapolate a little bit on that, to later why those things might be. The whole, and it was just supposed to be this weird, thing that basically as you're playing it, you're hypnotized into it. It was lights and flashing and colors. And that could also be well, that's kind of what arcade games were, but circa 1981, you're still in the real heyday of that. You figure you're only a couple years out from Pong at that point, it's my theory on this is always, and it's come up that people have pointed to oh, well, there might be this game, might be that game, things like that. But there's, I think Tempest was likely would be the closest analog to I think what that was. And if no one's ever played Tempest or seen the game Tempest, if you can actually play a real version of it, the actual arcade version of it, it is a pretty wild thing. I mean, it's the first color vector game. So the difference between the vector games and the CRT games at the time is the way that it almost feels more like a laser show. In say the 90s or early 2000s, it'd be really hard to come across an arcade cabinet version of it just floating around somewhere because the vector monitors were hard to maintain. A lot of them also because they were pushing the system at the time. Like a lot of them would fail constantly, like even in the 80s, you know. I could not track this down, but there is like a conjecture, and this is like also sort of in the like urban legend kind of spectrum, is that the first times where people start reporting like seizures from our, you know, because think about even like the warnings on like Nintendo games and things like games of like this could cause seizures and stuff like that, and this is before the Pokemon television show caused all those kids to have seizures or whatever in Japan. But it was like, but we knew that would
because they were all so cute.
Yeah. There's like there was a but 1981 is right around when the first reported seizures are happening in video games. Tempest is also released in 1981. It is like the difference between seeing one, like I've only ever really played them at like small conventions or whatever. It's like it is very vibrant. It's like really colorful when the monitor is working right, and it like, and I could see why that could, and that was like they didn't know that was going to happen, you know, like people. So there might be some. So I'm gonna tack that down to say like that's probably like at least some of the inspiration of this idea, you know, is like probably in there. Some of the things with the Polybius thing is like that maybe it's like weird tech that was related to like Operation Paperclip or something like that they were developing from space program things. That was one of the things. The Men in Black showing up and tracking data on the stuff. It also feels a little vaguely like the Last Starfighter kind of thing, like seeing has high scores. You know, it's like it's like there's a you know, and see for like, oh, maybe there's a, you know, a reason like these people are good at it. But Atari would actually like put unmarked arcade cabinets into places to play test them, like, and people would go and check like how many coins were put in, what are the high score rotations and things like shady things like that.
Yeah. Arcades were actually like kind of a place for like shady little mini crimes to happen.
Yeah.
You know,
Drug dealing.
Yeah, exactly.
So
I mean, if it's like a
that
laser show, you need to get your recreational consumables. So,
and it is like a laser show. So I'm wondering if the Polybius thing is very like the idea is it's supposed to be this kind of, you know, early weird version of like, and also like an experience that you really can't have outside of an arcade game itself. You know, you're in this dark room, there's all the sounds, there's lights, and this thing is just like really glowing even more than the other stuff, you know, stuff. It must be an interesting idea. Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting because like you've got it at a time. So this is occurring at a time when people are like really obsessed with video games. I mean, that hasn't really changed, but it's just like the shape of what it is, you know. But like this was new. There were people like playing for 20 hours or something like that, you know, and just kind of like, well, what happens if you stay up for that long? Now, you know, you start having some wonky image. You start running away from mirrors. you start hallucinating. So things, not to mention things, your ability to control your body temperature, your blood sugar and things starts to get affected when you're in that sleep deprivation world. And staring at a screen intently with all those neurochemicals going through, you know.
Probably consuming at the least vast amounts of caffeine, if not other substances available. And then thinking about even like Portland in the 80s and 90s, I mean, maybe so less so today, but like those, you know, it does seem to be the hot, like, you know, a countercultural hotbed area, you know. So it's, you know.
I was fascinated by this because, probably not surprisingly, when it comes to like the mind control elements, which is its own little thing, we can just definitely jump down that rabbit hole at some point. But the like the old ideas of hypnosis and how it worked, and I say old ideas, I mean old pop culture ideas, because I mean Dave Ellman was like changing up the way hypnosis was done mid 20th century. You know, you had Milton Erickson and so like by the time we get to things like I think about The Prisoner, the sci-fi show The Prisoner, and you've got the hypnosis episode, and it's like a blinking light. It's like if only it were that easy.
Sometimes it's also like auditory sounds and weird things, like some of these things combined.
So you
know?
do start to have. There are some things that are of disputed effectiveness when it comes to altering your mental state. Binaural beats, binaural sounds, and the idea with these is that you've got essentially. Luckily, I've got some music people here. You've got one tone that is, so it's a headphones thing. You have a speaker on one ear, speaker on the other. So going through one ear is one tone. Going through another ear, your other ear is a different tone. And then your brain basically hallucinates and makes up the difference to create a tone that is not either of those tones, but is sort of a synthesis of those two tones. Does that sound right, Dan?
Yeah,
you know more about any of this sound part
that's
of it.
completely right. And it's usually done to quote unquote hear frequencies that you can't normally hear. So for instance, if you, I want to say it's like sub 10 hertz. I want to say it's like 9 or 6 or something like that. But what you do is you basically do exactly what you said. You get these two frequencies that they are, and I'm assuming this out. I can't remember exactly because I haven't looked at this in a long time, probably about 2 years. But it's you might have something that is 250 hertz on the left, 256 hertz on the right. The difference is 6 hertz. You quote unquote hear 6 hertz. And I can't remember if one has to be out of phase so it cancels out. I can't remember the specifics, but that's the very general version of how it works.
Yeah. And so the idea. Go ahead. Yeah.
I definitely wanted to try this, but the video on YouTube I was watching, they said that there are possible side effects of that, including like people can have seizures from it. So I was like, once I read that or heard that, I was like, you know what? As cool as it sounds, I don't know that I want to give that a go because seizures in and of themselves, the idea of it freaks me out for some reason. I don't know why, but it just really creeps me out. So I'm like, not really.
It's not. It's not the thing you want to.
No.
It's particularly and that but that like kind of makes sense of like this whole like video game thing is like supposedly like it's got all these weird lights, it's got all these weird sounds, like it's like if it does seem mysterious, and probably like also like not that we don't have a government paranoia thing going on in our current timeline, but the 80s definitely has a different type of government paranoia. I think it's like it's very easy to believe like, oh yeah, well maybe like this is a way to like that and you could probably talk more about this, Chris, but like MK Ultra kind of idea, but it's more like, oh well, if we could just find ways of hypnotizing the youth to get them, this idea of like they were it's like we're still getting into the like all of these things being like it's the start of the heightened version of the corrupting youth forces, and it would possibly be the belief of the youths at the time that maybe people would use it to like try to do like it's like because it's like you're figuring you're like it's much more like video games and Dungeons and Dragons and all these like weird like things that like pop culture to like the extreme is where that like begins in the 80s versus say like earlier. Or it's not that they didn't have pop culture or youth corrupting things, but it was always like, well, it's rock and roll or punk or something, and it's like, or jazz, it's like drugs. But it's like now it's like video games are a whole weird thing. It's not like pinball. You figure like pinball and penny arcade type things have been around, for eons at that point. And then like, boom, video games start showing up in arcade cabinets. And then that's like, and that just skyrockets in a couple of years. Like it goes like,
So it's interesting, like games for a long time have been suspect. Games in general. So you go back to like the arrival of cards in Europe. This was a problem. Cards originated probably in China, came in to Europe probably by way of Egypt.
I just want to interject for 1 second. I find it kind of funny, like in our current climate, like China this, China that, all of our products, not all, in quotes, all of our products come from China. It's like, where'd the cards come from? They came from China.
they invented paper
way earlier than we did.
They like, it's like.
But so the cards show up via that route. Is the first ones I think were the Mumluck decks, and so it was sort of like China, Islamic territories, and then whoosh, eventually up into Europe. And by the time you're there, it's kind of like, well, it's a tavern thing. You're also like, it's very Christian Europe. You've got this idea about controlling fate and trying to do things to control fate, and that's wrong, unless it's prayer, in which it's right. But, this kind of idea, like, but games were like very suspect. And because they're happening in taverns and it involves gambling and things, like, it might actually be dangerous. It might be dangerous in a different kind of way. You figure like tarot as a way of fortune telling, it didn't start like that. It was a game. Like Taroki is a game. And so not a lot of people still play it, but it's when people started realizing you could use these things for other things, but they were suspect from the beginning. And it's like that, Dungeons and Dragons, a role-playing game. But it's like, what's going on though? So when you've got probably the man of the house at the tavern gambling in this seedy environment, or you've got your shady teenagers in this shady environment putting coins into these machines, or you've got these shady teenagers in another environment, rolling dice and, I don't know, apparently worshiping the devil. It's like this kind of idea of like you're outside of those realms of control too, and that's kind of a.
Just as an insert too, like pinball was banned in New York. Even though there was places you could play it, it was like technically illegal up until like the 70s because like in the early, it was linked to organized crime and gambling parlors, and gambling was illegal, and so therefore pinball was illegal. Like so, it took that. It's like this kind of like, even though it's like you didn't really bet on it, it was more just like it was just a game, but like most games were linked to gambling or something or doing something like that, and since that stuff was illegal, this was like so kind of like the more legalization of like arcades and games that are more for amusement, like versus games that were intended, it's like that even doesn't really start until like, and then this, so it's like where then you can have like places where a third space but for teenagers usually before it'd be like, oh, a dance hall, but now you have like these kind of more seedier environments but populated by younger people.
Yeah, so it's interesting though, like the idea of like a mind controlling video game. Could you do it? And I think actually now you could. I think we do have the technology now. So like when it comes to like mind control or hypnosis, it's not enough just to create an altered state. So like blinking lights or binaural beats or things like that, they can create an altered state. There's also a thing we'll talk about at some other point called the the frequency following response. And that has to do with a phenomenon called entrainment. And that's where like something in your creature, I'll give a more concrete example in a second, links up with something outside of you and then is influenced by that thing. And so there's a hypnotist called Milton Erickson, and very famous hypnotist, who used to do something. He was known for doing sort of what some people refer to as like a covert or conversational hypnosis. Our Ericksonian hypnosis is what we call it now. But where he might take his finger and mirror your breathing. So he would kind of have his finger on his shoulder or something like that. And as you breathed in, he would raise his finger up. And as you breathed out, he would lower his finger down. Very subtle and probably something you weren't picking up. And what he would do is after after he'd done it for a minute, he would change the rate at which he was moving his finger. And the client would change the rate at which they were breathing. So an arcade game in the 1980s might not know the rate at which you're breathing, or your galvanic skin response, or your brainwave behavior. Okay. But we have the technology to do that stuff now. So as we move into more and more immersive forms of video gaming where that stuff is feeding back into the big game and altering its response based on your level of engagement. Yeah, you could do it. You could do it, especially if you build a character, you know, you go through this like involved process of building a character that actually on some level is actually like psychologically probing you, you know? Could you do it now? I think so. I don't know if you could like Manchurian candidate somebody, but you can definitely get them to buy Mountain Dew. I mean, you could do that without without all that stuff. So,
Yeah,
you know,
I mean, I think it's interesting about these things is like there's also like this dark kind of fears, you know, like these things arise from like these kinds of like fear of being controlled, fear of losing oneself, fear of, you know, being, you know, it's like manipulated. It's like, and it's just, it is kind of a like a weird thing that's like, well, of course that's going to happen in a dark place with flashing lights and weird things. Going back to like the whole Tempest thing and like, but this probably can go back to like our whole dreams and things and stuff coming out of that stuff. So there's like a period in video games where like video games are kind of made by like a person or like two people. And then there's like, then video games are made by like hundreds of people on big teams. And that's still the case. But now we've kind of also shifted into an era where like, at least in indie games, you can make like something that amounts to like a very popular game and like one person could make it, like it could be like a passion project, like something like a Stardew Valley, or even like more recently like a Balatro. Like it's like, you know, it's, you can make, one person can make a game and it can sell a gazillion copies, you know. It's like but it's like, but in this period still in like this like video game history, you're still having like kind of like one person or a couple people working on something. And like the person who created Tempest, Dave Turrier, he also created like Missile Command. He had worked on like some other games, so those are like the two like really big ones. And then he actually worked on like one of the first 3D, like commercially released 3D games and stuff.
As a side note, Missile Command, was that similar to the game in what was the movie? War Games. Is that similar, or are they not?
I'm trying to remember, like, I'm kind of, like, isn't he playing that in the beginning?
Thermonuclear war.
Yeah, but Missile Command is it's a again like, and it is really weird. It's a trackball game, right? It's like very, and it's another one of these kind of like super, because I mean at the time it's just like you're dealing with like these like flat graphical, you know, like it's like, you know, this is like, yeah, and it's you're defending bases from missiles coming in, but it's supposed to be like aliens. But it's like, but both of those games and like are like interesting. It's like Dave Turrier, he said when he was working on Missile Command, he kept having this dream that like all these missiles were coming into the major cities in California, because it's the 80s, you know, and destroying the city. Like he was driving down the highway and the cities are being like destroyed or something. And it's like, and in that you're defending like 3 areas, but they're like not labeled as like, you know, they're not specifically that. So it's like it's supposed to be aliens. It's not the Russians nuking. But in mind, I think the lines, it's pretty easy to blur the lines. And then like and like Tempest, when like he's working on that, it's like him and like you know, a person working on the engineering end of things to get the vector, the color vector to work. And like, you know, and that's like basically like one other person making sure things are maintained as they're doing testing and stuff like that. And it's like, but he had a dream, like he said, from like his childhood of like these monsters coming out of the ground and trying to pull him into the, you know, like, and so like Tempest is like this, that is kind of this thing. It's like you're like, it's like, it's almost like the idea is like it's in a first person perspective. You're going through a tube. It's in space supposedly, but like these monsters they come out of that, and you have to keep them going down. And there's like a really like weird, and it's like, so like these are almost like these weird kind of like variants of like some strange version of art, you know. It's like, because even in the like the Missile Command, the thing, it doesn't say game over like when you lose. It's like, because they're still messing with that, but it says like the end, you know, when you're like, it's like that's it, like, you know, you like, it's like the world is and so there's this like weird idea of like these weird things that come out of like dreams and strange things, and then they become sort of parts of these now like urban legends and myths. And one time in an interview, like David Lynch had talked about he thinks creativity and like his ideas, it's like he's like you're basically just like a radio antenna, and you just pick up these ideas, and then you as the artist, it's your intention to like manipulate the idea that you've picked up and put it out there like as best you can.
Going back to if this could be done, if it were possible. So Bobby, you talked a little bit about, you know, the hypnotism component to it.
Yeah.
So going back and kind of sticking with that and kind of extrapolating a little bit. So my understanding, you know, you hear from you know, pop culture or whatever, when it comes to hypnotism, you can't do something you wouldn't normally do. So if I'm not the kind of person that is violent, you know, you can't hypnotize me to be violent, we'll say. And I'm very much oversimplifying this.
Right.
But over time, through hypnosis, if you can change different behaviors, I'm inclined to think you could probably change a person to be the kind of person you want them to be. So can you, with your background in hypnotism, what would that be like? Like, could this be done? Could you, in fact, over time, change people to do anything?
I think so. I think with like the right like certain people would be easier. And which, by the way, like there's a misconception that like smart people can't be hypnotized is not true. It's actually going into hypnosis is a skill. However, going into like the idea with hypnosis is like this idea that you can't be hypnotized against your will, first of all. And that's kind of true. But if you're calling it hypnosis, like sometimes if people are playing along with a process, then they're already kind of in it. Now, there's a world famous hypnotist, magician person, mentalist, I guess, Darren Brown, that did a deep dive on the Manchurian Candidate type thing to see if he could take a highly responsive subject, which again, you can build your responsiveness for those of you that want to be good at, you know, trancing out. Some people are just more prone to it than others. And so he took a very responsive subject and worked with him over a period of like a few weeks or a month or two or something like that to see if he could create a quote unquote Manchurian Candidate, which for those that don't know, it's the idea of could you create a secret assassin that would then also forget that they were the assassin? Could you,
based on the movie, right? The Manchurian Candidate.
yeah, and that's the idea. And so it's like, but there was this thing of like, was this kind of a thing really being done? And so when we get into the world of MK Ultra, which we won't get too into today, but like it's this, it was a mind control experiment run by the government to see how far you could push mind control or behavioral control of an individual. Probably,
I can also
but,
just,
you know,
I was just throw too, like,
Yeah.
like Dan was saying, like, there's other, like, you know, environment, like you without even hypnosis, obviously you can have environmental manipulation, like, just, so if people listening don't know, my wife is a behavior analyst, so I learned a lot about behavioral stuff. It's a other topic, you know, it's like, but, you know, but environmental manipulation is one of the, like, they say manipulation, they'll mean like they're trying to manipulate you, but like changing things in the environment will change behavior, right? And so like, I guess like the most like probably famous versions of that would probably be like Phillips and Bardo and the Stanford prison experiment, right? Like he took like just students that were friends, put them into random groups, split them. One became prisoners, one became guards, and he was the acted as the warden. He set up cameras and just to watch it, and it got to such a point that these people were abusing each other. They were going through psychological problems. It was like. And they didn't do anything hypnotic. They just said, "These are your roles. Go play them out." And they
wasn't it in like a crazy amount of time, like within like just a couple of days, it got essentially out of control. That yeah.
And he said he was like, I think there's like from the couple of things I've seen him talk about it, like it was like like in videos and stuff. Like he said he was losing his kind of like as the person supposedly controlling, you know, this kind of thing. It's like he's losing himself in the experiment, and it's like, you know, I mean, and so environmental manipulation, yeah, it could be a form of like, you know, change, and like could change you and turn you from a not violent, not aggressive, and intelligent people. These are people that are college students, like it's like these aren't, it's like they're, they have some doing, in a pretty respected school. It's like they're not exactly, it's just, yeah, I think it's like, so like probably the fears of like going back to like the video game thing of, I think what's interesting about the Polybius thing is it's less about, I feel like the dangers of video games, especially when we were kids, was more shifted to like the parents trying to protect the youth, right? This thing. Where in this case with Polybius, it's the youth thinking something outside of us is trying to change us. It's like the broader systems, the government, Men in Black, weird things. They're trying to do something to us. Like it's like it's a different type of. It's like they're not trying. You're not trying. It's not like systems are trying to protect you to keep you safe and stop you from becoming like violent offenders because you played too much Mortal Kombat or whatever, or Time Crisis or something, at that time, it's like, or listen to too much like gangster rap or whatever it was. Like, it's like, it's the opposite. It's like, are they trying to manipulate us? Is this like shady organizations trying to change us? I don't know. It's just like a kind of, in a weird space that's kind of, maybe you could feel that. It's like, that is a sort of, it's like a reverse version of that that kind of fear or something, paranoia.
If I were going to do it, I would start by actually studying the processes of cults and how they indoctrinate. One thing I would do is it would be an online game, and there'd be a community. So you'd build in the social proof element of it. There would be events that take place at weird times that would interrupt your sleep pattern, and they would be like very important to do these things to level up, so you'd be effing up your sleep thing. There'd be certain insider outsider type things I do to create this sense. This is not a smear on geocachers. I actually think they're really cool. But geocachers kind of think it's like they're geocachers, and then they'll refer to people that aren't geocachers as muggles. It's like
real quick. Explain geocaching for anyone that might not be familiar.
Geocaching is a treasure hunting like activity where certain caches, or like a treasure, where certain caches are left. The information's left online, and you use GPS and your own hunting skills to go and track them down. And sometimes it's a thumb drive stuck in a tree and you can download files from it, or it's a little box and it's got little trinkets in it and you can take something and leave something. And so but it's this activity of these people that will go out and hunt these locations using these devices, and they're a little niche little group. So there's an inside and outside when it comes to geocachers, but I think they're all very welcoming to people that want to be in it.
Yeah, you could just start doing it. It's like pretty much like you don't need to have a community or have a
but if you made this game, this theoretical game that you actually did, you needed to get in. It was like kind of exclusive. Now you've got the makings of a thing where you actually really could create a manipulation system to build. You could I want to use terms to get us defunded, hypothetically defunded. Sorry for costing us our Mountain Dew subscription.
Way to go.
Yeah. I was working on that too.
my bad. You can just get me out of the show. Put it in the comments if you want me out of sorry, guys. Yeah. Well, I was going somewhere with that, but you guys can take it away. I apparently crashed and burned.
So yeah, but the thing about it, again, like going back to like, I wonder what, I mean, something that comes out of these like weird urban legend type things that are like, or haunted, like it's like if it's just a regular cursed object, then you could just say, well, that's just a thing. We know it's like the curse is just whatever the vague implications are that will happen when you operate this thing. Like, I think there's supposed to be like more modern versions of this, or like there's like it's like a weird Pokemon game. It was like an unreleased cartridge, and it'd go to a thing, and like the town, and everyone's like, when you're visiting on the game, you like end up in this town that's like a secret town, and everyone's dead or something, and then you die or something. You know, like it kind of like that kind of thing. Or like there's another one that's like you play through and it causes you to lose your mind and you commit suicide or whatever. But it's all like kind of based on these things. But I feel like the weird thing of the Polybius thing is like there's no like end game. Like what was the intention of the mind control? I don't know, to I guess raise like get people to join the military during the Cold War. I mean, that seems like
Just put in more quarters.
Yeah, it's like more quarters. Yeah, like
They had to pay back the demons for the vector technology.
Yeah, yeah,
And,
yeah. It's like or the space, you know, the Project Paperclip, you know, it was the Area 51. That's where we got the vector technology from.
I mean, how would aliens play video games? You know, if it weren't like this.
Yeah, that's the only way they know how. Like it's but
I don't want these fighting games. I just want geometric.
yeah.
Yeah. So, would you want to play it?
Well, yeah, I guess yeah. I guess let's start the creepy thing of that. Yeah. What's my rating? Well, it's like real. Like, I mean, vast research do not think that an actual Polybius cabinet is real. I think it's like something that got brought up a little later that were probably based on certain things that were happening around that time period, but like people are remembering it through like a playground nostalgia lens. There were probably things that were happening though, like definitely there were FBI staking out arcades and stuff like that to bust people for drugs and drug rings, and organized crime is around that stuff, you know. And there's the Atari putting out like the you know, like test cabinets and tracking them and seeing like what's going on, you know. Like it's like so even though I like the idea of the evil video game cabinet as a thing, yeah, I don't know if I feel like it's like that real. If it were, will I want to play a arcade cabinet that's going to fry my brain? Probably not. But yeah, but I'm gonna. So I mean, but the idea of a thing that you don't know, that you just think you're just gonna go and have some fun, and then the next thing you know, you're mind controlled or dead or whatever the end result is, you know, that's kind of scary. Like, you know, you like linking fun to the thing. So I'm gonna give it 3 monsters, even though this is like one of my favorite things. I'd like to rank it higher, but I just think it's more just like it's just the randomness of being afraid of, you know, like everyday kind of objects or new experiences. Like maybe there's like just that kind of fear of like, I've never been to this place, I've never experienced something like this, and then like this thing might kill me, you know. And it's like probably not, but it's like that's scary, you know. So I'll give it like, if it were a real, there was a real chance that like one of 100 video game cabinets would do something horrible to you, yeah, I'd probably be scared of that at that time period, especially when you're in like it's a pretty prevalent thing for kids to do. Yeah.
I don't think it's as scary for me. I find it fascinating.
You do want to be killed by
We probably will be, you know, but yeah. Yeah, I think I find it fascinating. I guess I guess the idea of mind control technology doesn't scare me as much as something like, say, like demonic possession or something. I think just because I'm more tuned to analog threats than digital ones. But however, when it comes to recognition, I think, yeah, like the cursed game that we didn't talk about like The Last Starfighter and like the way these things like we also didn't talk about something that's becoming much more a topic of conversation right now, which is the effect of devices on neurochemistry and the idea of like hacking dopamine and like how do things keep you doing things and making devices more.
Let's circle back to that after the ratings, because I think we can do a little there. That could be fun.
Yeah.
So there's all that stuff, and in some ways that's scary from a social perspective. But yeah, I'm gonna say this of the things we've talked about so far, this is probably the least scary for me, just probably because I don't think it exists yet, and could be potentially the most scary because you notice and that with yet, I do think the era of software and the era of digital technology that influences the human character is we're just scratching the surface on it, and it could go really poorly or it could go really well, but usually things that could go really poorly or really well go more in the poorly direction.
Yeah.
First,
you get about 20% well and then 80%
yeah.
poorly. Yeah,
So I'm gonna give this, I think I'm gonna give this two wide-eyed fascinated monsters that may well be engaged in a video game that's controlling their mind and making them stab each other. Yeah, two full complete monsters for me. That could become scarier if you add in other plot elements.
So Polybius is really interesting. So growing up, I was very much a video game nerd. Loved just playing video games for hours and hours and hours. You know, console, arcade, whatever. As I became an adult, unfortunately, not as much time to invest. Yes, I do say invest in video games. But oddly enough, I never heard of Polybius until just a few years ago. I'm very curious about, on a general level, general population, how much people have even really heard about this. Like, we've all heard about various conspiracy theories, but Polybius never really seems to make it up to the general population. Bob, I'm kind of like with you. I don't find this scary at all. There's this comic XKCD, and it's all about like tech and science and kind of thing. And it's drawn like with stick figures and very, very entertaining. But I immediately thought of this one comic when we were talking about the concept of mind control. And the idea behind this particular comic is that how to break into someone's account when they have a super strong password. And the one way, it's like you spend 3 years trying to, random password generator trying to get it. And then, like, I think the final frame, it's like a guy walking into where the other guy is. He has a hammer. I kind of think about that with this. It's like, if you're going to do mind control on someone, there's got to be an easier way. I think simple blackmail or extortion, would probably get the job done for most people. So from a scary perspective, I don't find it to be all that scary. Like we already said, not real. However, there are people that have made Polybius-like machines or games based on what we know about what it could have been like. So that's kind of interesting. I believe it's, I just had it up on the side here. Lamasoft's 2016 Polybius for PS4/VR. So if anyone is interested in seeing what it could have been like, you can check that out. We do not get any kind of commission on that, so that's a free plug for them. Were you going to say something?
I was just like, do you have your final rating? What are you giving it? Did you give that?
Yeah, so tying it up, I have zero interest in encountering it. A vector-based game from like the 80s, zero interest. Kind of like you, Baba, I'm giving this two monsters, but kind of giving the eye face. Just kind of like very unimpressed, just kind of like, that's it. Well,
I would just say that just as a throw-out thing, like, just, feels like this, I feel like Chris is always famous for inviting the audience to do things. If you can play a real, like, just as, so if my thoughts about this are right, and it's like not, because there's nothing proven about it, it's like that Polybius really is just like, it was just a kind of conflated with prototype Tempest, right? If you can play an actual version of Tempest, like it, like not the arcade one up, not on a computer or Tempest 2000 or whatever this thing, like an actual straight up like the vector arcade game with a good functioning spinner, because it has its own weird control that's not like any other arcade game as well. Like there's like 2 or 3 other arcade games that use the spinner control. Like it is a cool thing, and it still like feels like really good. Like today it feels like really good. It's like just the style of gameplay, and it is kind of hypnotic. Like it was only like so many years ago I just got to actually play like a real one of it that wasn't just like versions on like the like a bad PC MAME port or something like that. Like it's not going to look this. It just doesn't have the same thing because it's like part of it is about the hardware and the like you need both the vector thing you need the spinner control, which if anyone doesn't know, it's a middle knob that kind of rotates because the thing is you're controlling your like essentially ship or gun or whatever, like your object that you use to stop these things that are coming at you around, like you have to move it around this tunnel, like so it's like, and you're shooting kind of into it, and it's like, but everything's like this weird geometric, it's like really it feels very art like in a sense because of like the really good use of the like limitations at the time, like not trying to make things look like like you think like Space Invaders, like weird little cute looking alien. It just looks like these weird shapes and things and are strange, and it's like it's cool. And it's like it's a cool experience. And if you get to go to like a weird little like video game convention or a place where people like bring their own like retro hobby arcade cabinets or something like that, I know there's a few of them around. It's like I would recommend playing it because usually those things once you're in they're free play. So, and if someone has a real version of it, like play it. I think it's like it's a cool experience if you're into retro video gaming and you haven't ever experienced that, or just like do something different. It's like
So if anyone has made it this far into the video, definitely check that out. Find a Tempest arcade box and then report back because I want to know about the experience.
Yeah.
And then when you do it, if no one's watching, I want you to lean up to the cabinet and go, "Are you in there?
Yeah.
Come forth if you're in there."
Yeah. Unplug it and see if it stays on. It's like
yeah. Big stylish.
Yeah.
Yeah. So technology that affects the brain, and of course, like mobile phones, cell phones, and their purported effect on society and endless scroll things and how they allegedly, or really not allegedly, how they affect people's dopamine. And the idea that if you get cheap dopamine, if you get cheap thrills, it actually makes the things that you would normally do to get dopamine less desirable because you can do these easy things to get it. And it actually sort of like drags down your dopamine levels because so when you've got when you want to do something, there's a thing called so you make a prediction, and there's a phenomenon called reward prediction error, which is when you think something's going to be really good and then you get to it and it's not that good. You hyped it up and it lets you down. But the problem is, so like if you're running on a treadmill every day, and you're just, once I get through all this, I'm going to buy myself a thing, and I'm just thinking about how good that thing's going to be. It's actually detrimental to your long-term ability to keep up with this thing, because what happens is when you get to that thing, it's not going to meet those expectations because of the way you hyped it up. And that's what's called reward prediction error. So actually your dopamine drops lower than it was before you started the process of hyping yourself up. It's really weird. But so one of the things, this is your takeaway, listeners. One of the things you can do is if you're trying to achieve a goal, you seize the narrative in the midst of that goal and you say, oh man, like this is really hard. That's why I'm doing it. I'm doing it to get stronger. And if you sort of take the reward and you put the effort as the reward that you're getting stronger now, your brain actually starts to link the dopamine to the effort instead of to the ice cream you're gonna get at the end of the week or at the end of the day, whatever. And so, but the thing is, we're being manipulated with dopamine all the time, and we're getting these cheap dopamine supplies, and it's tanking motivation, or at least that this is the interpretation of what's happening, that it's tanking our motivation because we're constantly basically using our phones like little slot machines. Well, they're programmed to act like slot machines, so that
Sometimes they are slot machines.
sometimes they actually are. Yeah, apparently that you can do that now too. What could go wrong? But that kind of idea of like, well, I just threw a whole lot out there. Feel free to stir it up and see how we go.
Related to all this stuff that we talked about, I think something we probably should deep dive on, because it's like, other though I'm all considerate about like the like why would someone want to mind control? Like, well, what are some of the ways that people do mind control that aren't these kinds of things? I don't know. So that might be something. Yeah, we should.
Yeah. And actually, because I mean, it's such a spectrum when it comes to mind control. We'll cover it all, though. Well, I will open that can of hypnotic worms.
That's your task.
Yeah. Oh my god, it's such a fun one.
I'm here for
here
for the video games and weird haunted objects. You can open the mind control.
Come for the video games, stay for the mind control.
Mind control.